Now, what insights can we draw into the constitutional rights of the people in a time as the economic crisis and the transformation into a political crisis as this? I've invited to join us virtually live right now President of the Bar Association of Sri Lanka, President's Council, Saliya Pieris. A very warm welcome to you and thank you for joining us, Mr. Pieris. Now, we're talking about the social media ban and how it has impacted society, but at the same time people circumnavigated the ban and were on social media. But what is the legal background to this? What constitutional rights do the people have at times as these?
So the social media ban, in fact the Bar Association of Sri Lanka has issued a statement on the ban of the social media, and we called upon the TRC to immediately to remove the ban. We think that the freedom of the right to disagree, the right to dissent is a very important aspect of fundamental rights. It is part of the freedom of expression. In the context of social media, it is part of the freedom of expression. And so the freedom of expression includes the freedom of speech, the freedom of publication. And when you say the freedom of expression, a person can express himself in many ways. It can be in writing, it might be by a symbol, it might be by some sort of symbol, even by one silence one can express oneself in so many ways. Justice Mark Fernando has held in a particular judgment that the voter expresses himself when he marks the cross on the ballot paper. So in so many ways, people express themselves. So social media today is equivalent to what a newspaper or a TV channel or a radio was 20 years ago. And it is important that social media be allowed, people be allowed to express themselves, express their views through the social media. Now, it might be sometimes what people do express on social media might be unpalatable. One might not like what is said. But
right.
that is
I'd like to talk about that, how governments can contain hate speech to misinformation, to disinformation. But before that, Mr. Pieris, I'd like to clarify on the constitutionality of also protests and marches at a time of a state of emergency and curfew, because our headline story was that we saw protests defying an ongoing state of emergency and a curfew.
Yes. So once again, the Bar Association yesterday, we issued a statement in respect of the declaration of the state of emergency. So the emergency is imposed for publics under the Public Security Ordinance, and it is when the country faces a security threat, when there is a threat to public security, that the president may declare a state of emergency. It has to be subsequently ratified by, it has to be confirmed by Parliament, but nevertheless, that is the basis for a state of emergency. Now, when a state of emergency is declared, the president gets an extraordinary power. That is the power to make emergency regulations. And under the emergency regulations, the president can suspend, override, amend any law, except the Constitution. So fundamental rights, the freedom of expression, are constitutional rights. Now, freedom of expression is not absolute. Similarly, we have another very important right connected to protest, that is the freedom of peaceful assembly.
Right.
And again, there is another right, the right to travel within Sri Lanka. Now, all these rights are subject to certain restrictions. One of those is in the interest of public order. So if they are in the interest of public order, fundamental rights can be restricted. So freedom of speech, freedom of expression, the right to protest can be restricted for public order, but only to that extent. Only to the extent that it is necessary to maintain public order.
Right.
So for instance, if
yes.
Sorry.
Does that mean walking to the streets, marching to the streets at a time of curfew and emergency law should be strictly adhered to?
No. So one must make a distinction between the emergency regulations and the curfew. The emergency regulations, up to now, we do not know what the regulations are. And so far, we have not seen what the emergency regulations are. So even if the president declares a state of emergency, that would depend on what the regulations are imposed. Now, even regulations which are imposed, the Supreme Court has held in a very important case called Joseph Pereira versus the Attorney General, that when regulations are imposed, they must have a nexus, a connection to the core, to the objective, which is sought to be achieved. So if you want to preserve public order or national security, public security, you can make regulations only to that extent.
Right.
So banning, so there would be, so prohibiting a peaceful protest would not come within the scope of the restrictions envisaged by the Constitution, only to the extent which is necessary. So if a person holds a placard outside his home, or if people gather for a peaceful protest, that is not, that could not be prohibited by emergency regulation. But anyway, up to now, we have not seen what these regulations are.
Right.
Now, your next question.
Yes.
Is on the, sorry.
Yes, I'll add another question due to the time constraints on the news. Adding to it, what of the rights of the protesters? We saw attorneys appearing free of charge on behalf of those arrested. But what of the rights, the human rights angle to the protesters here?
Yeah, so first of all, once again, those who are engaged in peaceful protests have a right to do so. If a person joins a protest and his objective is peaceful, then he has all the rights. But if he becomes violent, then of course, if an assembly is unlawful, then the police can intervene and even disperse the unlawful assembly. But even if the police arrest a protester on the basis that he was a member of an unlawful assembly, that person has to be treated, cannot be subject to assault, cannot be subject to torture. So even if a person is arrested, but I say that if the protest is peaceful, there's a famous Janakosha case where the Supreme Court has clearly held that if a protest, as long as it is peaceful, as long as there is no threat to public order, then arresting a person for being part of that protest would be unlawful.